Hello and welcome to Portfolio Matters. In today's episode, we will be talking about the market for vanadium and for vanadium redox flow batteries. But before we get into it, Richard will read the disclaimer.
Thank you, Keith. Everything discussed during the Portfolio Matters podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. Listeners should be aware that we will be discussing securities that we own or have a financial interest in. Please do your own research or consult a professional investment advisor before making any decisions regarding topics mentioned on the show. A full disclaimer can be found at the end. Over to you, Keith.
Thank you, Richard. I am going to be doing a share talk on the South African vanadium producer and owner of some vanadium redox flow battery investments, Bushveld Minerals. But before we did that, I wanted to look into the market for vanadium itself. Okay, so the conclusion from this is going to be that the vanadium is a small market and that it could be tipped into deficit by the incremental demand for vanadium from VRFBs. However, any deficit would not be long lasting because vanadium is quite abundant and there's no shortage of it. Also, vanadium redox flow batteries face strong competition from lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion batteries are essentially half the price, even for utility level operations. Now, electrolyte rental, which is the new idea from vanadium redox flow battery manufacturers and producers, is going to reduce the price differential between vanadium redox flow batteries and lithium ion. However, if the vanadium price goes through the roof, then vanadium redox flow batteries will simply be priced out of the market. Now, when we look at the vanadium market, it has very strong price demand inelasticity. So small changes in supply and demand have big consequences for the market. And you'll see that means price spikes. But the price spikes don't last because there's no shortage of it and supply comes on stream. Okay, so what is vanadium used for? Well, the overwhelming use of vanadium is in the steel industry, and adding 0.1% vanadium to steel doubles the strength of the steel, which is absolutely extraordinary. So there are various regulations which mandate a certain amount of vanadium being used in steel. And if we look at the abundance of vanadium in the Earth's crust, it is the 22nd most abundant element, 120 parts per million, which makes it twice as abundant as copper. Vanadium's 120, copper 60. However, when we look at the 2019 annual world production of vanadium, it was only 111,000 tons, whereas copper production was 20 million tons. So there's absolutely no question that you could produce a lot more vanadium if there was the need to. Historically, vanadium market has had extreme price spikes, generally associated with anticipated changes in Chinese regulation, which would mandate higher vanadium percentages in steel rebar. So if we look at the 2018 price spike, China was just about to announce some new regulations and the price spiked in anticipation of that. But when the regulations actually came into force, the enforcement was patchy, and also there was a lot of substitution of vanadium for niobium, and also the price spike incentivized new Chinese production of vanadium, and China is the largest producer of vanadium, with the result that the market went into glut and the price collapsed again. And as you can see, the price since then has been low, although it's ticked up recently, as these charts show.
Can I just say, it rather looks like the reaction function of vanadium producers is very quick, because that price spike was very short in a mining sense. So the response time must have been quick in order to supply the increased demand so rapidly, for the price to drop so quickly.
Well, it's also a question of how much speculation there was in the market, Richard. And I suspect there's quite a lot of speculative demand, taking supply out of the market. And then when they found that actually the Chinese steel producers didn't want to buy it all off them at vastly inflated prices, they had to sell it again.
Yeah.
Vanadium price has been picking up. So top right, you see the price in Europe, which is now $7 a pound. And that is a big increase from December. So you're talking about a 40% increase in 3 months. But on this chart, it's barely a blip. So bearing in mind, it hit $28 a pound 3 years ago. Okay, so we go on to supply. The majority of vanadium production is as a byproduct from the manufacture of iron ore for steel. So magnetite has 1 to 1.5% vanadium in it. So as you produce iron for steel, you're also producing vanadium. And as you can see on the right here, China is 59%, so the majority of production. And South Africa, where Bushveld Minerals are, and we will be covering in the next couple of days, is only 9%. And this is how it's produced. So the ore is always magnetite. And if you're producing steel, you produce the, you smelt the ore, you produce the steel, and you get vanadium as a byproduct. However, in South Africa, steel production is uneconomic. So they just produce vanadium. And this is the production over time of vanadium. And what you can see is that the price spike in 2018, 2019 caused a supply response. But the supply response wasn't enormous, and that was still enough to completely kill the vanadium price. So it's a very price inelastic market, price demand inelastic. Steel. Obviously the majority of vanadium use is in steel, and the steel market is growing and is continuing to grow. And you may be aware that President Xi of China has been saying that he intends to increase infrastructure investment and increase the transport links with marginal cities in China. So there's still a lot of demand coming from China for steel. And as China develops, you would expect the quality of the steel it uses to increase. So in North America, you have 1% vanadium steel, whereas in China it's half that. So if China starts using better quality steel, then its vanadium consumption should presumably go up. But in 2018, there was these new high-strength rebar standards introduced in China, which caused the price spike. And as we've seen, they weren't actually enforced very well, and the price collapsed again. So I think the importance of these regulations, mandates, can be overstated. Okay, so moving on to batteries. Now, vanadium redox flow batteries are an alternative to lithium ion, and basically involves having 2 separate tanks. One tank having vanadium in its 2 plus and 3 plus oxidation states, and the other in its 5 plus and 4 plus oxidation states. And essentially, you have a membrane here. You pump the vanadium round until it's in the reaction tank, and there ions move across the membrane and electrons move around the circuit. And if you charge the battery, the electrons go one way, and if you discharge them, move the other way. And what is quite cool about this whole process is that as the oxidation states change amongst in the electrolyte tanks, so the color changes. And if you look online, there are some nice videos of this in action, and we will include one of the videos in one of the links to this podcast. But the big thing is it has a longer battery life. So vanadium redox flow batteries can essentially be charged and discharged, and there is no reduction in the battery capacity. Whereas, as you will all know from the experience of your phone battery, lithium-ion batteries lose their capacity over time. The other great thing about vanadium redox flow batteries is because the electrolytes are aqueous, they don't catch fire. So on the left here, you see various pictures of lithium-ion battery storage facilities or Teslas bursting into flame. That can't happen with vanadium redox flow battery. Okay, so moving on to the positives. So the University of Swansea have done a review of the battery energy storage systems in the UK, their advantages and disadvantages. And the advantage of this source of information is their objective. So positives: can be used for a very large number of cycles, essentially doesn't decay. By adding electrolyte, you can just change the energy storage capacity. Have low standby losses, so if it's charged and just sitting there, it doesn't decay, the power doesn't do any decay. It's also tolerant of changes in current densities and temperatures, and able to provide power for a long period, longer than 24 hours. It has no significant safety and environmental issues. Can be idle for long periods without losing storage capacity, high energy conversion rate, small self-discharge, tolerant of overcharging, and you can completely discharge it without destroying the battery, unlike lithium ion. What are the negatives? Well, the big negative is the cost. They're expensive. Lithium-ion systems in the 4 to 6 hour duration range roughly cost half as much as flow batteries. This is figures from 2019. Now, the electrolyte rental will reduce the upfront cost of a vanadium redox flow battery by a third, but it will still be more expensive.
Also, Keith, the rental of the vanadium solution, I mean, it's simply a form of funding, isn't it? A leasing or whatever, where you can lease, industrial equipment can be leased, or
Yes.
in any case, it's basically saying this battery is like any other piece of capital equipment. You can lease it. I
That's
don't see it
exactly right.
as being any.
Well,
Sorry?
the thing is, if you look at things on a internal rate of return or net present value, the fact you've reduced the upfront cost actually substantially increases the value of the project.
Well, I suspect that's not right, Keith, because the funder will be taking a return.
Yes.
And the return the funder will take will be the difference. So ultimately, I suspect all you're doing is saying you're cash flowing it, you're making it easier to buy from a cash flow point of view, but actually by funding it, probably the cost of the whole facility over the lifetime increases slightly because you're paying a funding cost to the funder. So I would say it's probably a non-advantage in reality, would be my view.
Okay. Well, the adherents will say that it is an advantage. So anyway, we'll.
I'm sure someone will explain to me why I'm wrong in due course.
Now, a big thing is that the VRFBs have low energy density, and so these electrolyte tanks are big and heavy, and that means you need a big building to hold them, and obviously also it means that they're not suitable for, say, transport. So you're not going to put fuel a car with a VRFB. The other thing is that the electrolyte needs to be pumped around the system, and that requires electricity. So there are parasitic losses from actually running the VRFB. It also says that complexity makes them unstable for small-scale operations, although I noticed that Enerox, the Austrian VRFB manufacturer that is owned by a consortium that includes Bushveld, sells household size ones. So, that's a pretty small scale operation and they're selling them. So now the round trip efficiency is 5 to 10% lower than lithium ion for DC. Now, Richard and I discussed this because it's saying that for AC, the round trip efficiency between lithium ion and vanadium redox flow batteries is comparable. But I wasn't aware that you could charge a battery with AC power. I thought it had to be DC. So anyway, if you know how that works, please get in touch. The other thing is that will this be the technology of the future? People are investigating lithium ion redox flow batteries, which will have up to 5 times the energy density. However, lithium doesn't have the various oxidation states, and so you would have to have a different element, titanium probably, in the other tank. And that means that if the two were to react, it would be much worse. People are forecasting big adoption of vanadium batteries in the future. You can see this is the forecast for the batteries in general for energy storage, utility level energy storage. And this is from the Visual Capitalist, not Bushveld, but and they're saying that vanadium will capture a certain percentage. But currently, they're just 2%. And when they're just 2%, overwhelmingly, that's in China. If you look at the rest of the world, really not much going on. If you go onto the Enerox website and look at their projects, they have 4 or 5, and they're all quite small. And this is the Dalian vanadium redox flow battery, 200 megawatts, 800 megawatt hours. So you can run the 200 megawatt plant battery for 4 hours is what that's saying. And look at the size of it. When we're talking about low energy densities, that's it.
Makes you think there must be a more efficient way of storing energy than in large tanks like this.
Well, there is, Richard, and it's the pumped storage, which we've been using for many years, but there's
Yeah.
a limited number of mountains it's suitable on. So
True,
here you
Keith.
have some big projects in China, you have some big projects in Japan, but the ones in, let's say, California, not big, 2 megawatt. But if you go onto the this website that is dedicated to Bushveld Minerals, called the Bushveld Perspective, they have a constantly updated list of big battery projects, and there are some big ones. So in China, there are several which are, 1,000 megawatts. And if you add all this up, they'll require 27,000 tons of vanadium. And bear in mind, only 111,000 tons are produced a year. So that is a very significant portion of annual production. So there's a big new source of consumption, potentially. Although these projects will come in over the course of years. There's not 1 year, this is over the years. Exponential growth is forecast for vanadium redox flow batteries. Of course it is. And if that were to come true, they're forecasting that there would be a need for 50,000 tons of vanadium per annum from 2027. Skeptical. If that caused the price of vanadium to spike, then nobody would be using vanadium redox flow batteries. They're already, much more expensive than lithium-ion batteries, and this would simply cause substitution for lithium ions. I have very strong doubts that rise in vanadium demand from VRFBs can cause a sustained rise in the price of vanadium, because people will simply substitute into the cheaper technology. Now, going back to Richard's point, and I should say this slide, Richard, comes from a website dedicated to green technology, and it ain't me. So they're saying it reduces the upfront cost of a VRFB by a third, although lithium ions will remain cheaper, but it improves the internal rate of return and improves the net present value.
Well, I would just say, Keith, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So the funder is going to be taking whatever the difference is, and the purchaser of the battery is going to be paying premium for the funding. That would be my sort of instinctive response. Yeah. So I'm dubious, actually.
Right. It depends on what sort of IRR you're demanding compared to what the rental price is from the manufacturer. This is the bear case. So this comes from somebody who is involved in the choice of technology for UK utility level battery installations are. And he was saying that the reality is, in this country, VRFBs are not gaining traction, mainly because lithium ion is just much cheaper. And he was saying the right lithium ion battery can last 20 plus years on 2 daily charge and discharge cycles. So,
absolutely, Keith. Also, if you put in lithium funding, you can reduce the NPV, increase the NPV, and reduce the IRR of a lithium battery storage facility as well, can't you? Using the same logic as using for the vanadium battery storage facility.
That's a very good point, Richard. And you can't, because the lithium is integral to the battery, and you can't get the lithium back out and return it to the manufacturer without destroying the whole battery. Whereas the point about electrolyte rental is that you can just drain the tanks, return the electrolyte to the manufacturer, and he can then send it back on to the next person.
Okay, so it can be recycled. Exactly. There's a recycling benefit.
Yeah, that's true. So lithium-ion batteries are the battery of choice, and you only have to think of the massive lithium-ion batteries installed by Tesla in Australia. It produced its own gigafactory to produce them. And also, energy density does matter. You saw the size of the Dalian battery. I mean, those are 2 enormous buildings for a 200 megawatt battery.
Do you know the relative volume densities, Keith, of lithium and vanadium batteries?
I don't, but they're likely to be multiples of each other. Okay, so what's supply outlook? Well, the supply outlook is pretty good. It's growing at 5% per annum. And there, as we saw earlier, there's no shortage of vanadium in the earth. Majority of vanadium is produced as a byproduct, and that's important because It means that the price signal from the vanadium market doesn't necessarily get through to the main producers. If 99% of your product is iron and 1% vanadium, then changes in the price of vanadium do not really make much of a difference to the end product price of your manufacturer. And so therefore, you're not really incentivized to produce a lot more iron in order to produce 1% more vanadium. So these are the price market balance forecasts from Roskill for vanadium. And they're saying this is the base case. And they are saying that actually they're forecasting a slight surplus in the vanadium markets for 22, 23, 24, 25. So that is not bullish for the price. But they're saying if vanadium redox flow batteries were to get a 25% market share for energy storage, then suddenly you get into a massive supply deficit. But we are very skeptical about this. For a start, you're saying that currently they only have 2% and they're going to get 25%. And if this were to happen, the price of vanadium would go through the roof because it's a very price demand inelastic, or its main market is, and you need it for steel. And if the price of vanadium went through the roof, then VRFBs would simply be uneconomic.
Yeah, and presumably, Keith, anyone who wants to build a large-scale VRFB, they're going to fix the price of vanadium at the point at which they order the plant, so they know what their price is. So as soon as the price starts to go up significantly, nobody orders a VRFB facility.
Yeah, precisely. But Roskill are bullish. They think the market's going to tighten. I don't quite understand that, given that they've just shown on their charts that it's going to be an oversupply from 23 to 26. But in 22, it could tighten.
Can I just comment once more on this issue of the funding? And so basically what they're saying is that vanadium has a residual value.
Yes.
Well, if it has a residual value, you put that into the NPV and IRR calculations anyway. So I remain firmly unconvinced that you can basically make the thing more cost effective by using this funding regime. Sorry, Keith, I just can't let this one go.
Well, fair enough. Well, we'll see whether it works or not, Richard. So anyway, if you're interested in this, there are two UK companies that have interest in vanadium, or pure plays. There's Invinity Energy Systems, which manufactures vanadium redox flow batteries. And there's Bushveld Minerals, which we will be talking about in due course, which is both a producer of vanadium and has equity stakes in VRFB battery manufacturers and is moving into vanadium electrolyte production and rental. So is tied into this market. So in conclusion, I think we're skeptical, really. I just don't think vanadium price can spike. It might be able to spike short term but that will only be caused by demand from steel. There's a lot of it out there. There will be a supply response. And if the price spikes, I think it will kill the VRFB market. Richard?
I agree, Keith. I think that I was interested. I think if you're and I know we're going to look at the manufacturers separately, but if you're a miner, I suspect that you'll have price spikes, but your profit per ton or per pound over the course of 5 years is probably not going to change very much. If you're a battery installer, then as long as the price of vanadium remains at an economic level, then there probably will be increasing demand for these things. So I suspect you need to sort of think separately about are you in the battery technology, or are you producing vanadium, getting it out of the ground? But I also think if you look at the picture of the enormous plant for the 200 megawatts, it sort of doesn't really ring true in the face of we want to be environmentally friendly, so we're going to dump X swimming pools full of vanadium solution in the ground, and build a big plant over it. It just doesn't seem to be consistent with the theme of minimizing your environmental impact.
No,
That's my.
I agree with you, Richard. I mean, when you're working out the CO2 cost of your battery installation, cost of manufacturing all the steel for your massive building, I wonder how much that is factored in, because those are not small installations.
They're not, and also the battery market is it's developing incredibly quickly, and people are working very, very hard to increase the efficiency of batteries. And the vanadium battery, just as you mentioned, the lithium flow battery, it is exposed to that technological risk.
It is, but the thing is, that people are also working very hard on improving the effectiveness of VRFBs. And one of the problems with vanadium redox flow batteries is that these vanadium oxides are not terribly soluble. So the electrolytes are relatively weak. And if you can increase the amount of these vanadium salts in solution, you will improve the energy density. And on various of these manufacturers' websites, they kind of forecast 50% increases in the energy density over the next 5 years. But obviously, all of that is easy to promise, but can they actually deliver it?
And they also need to be able to deliver it in conjunction with the increasing energy density of all other batteries on the market, which is also happening as at the same time. So, yeah, I mean, I can see if you took that big plant and it had a 10 times energy density than the current one, it would be a 2 gigawatt plant. You think, well, that's probably a different case entirely.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Richard. If you have any comments and would like to point out why we are wrong in our skepticism, please do so. You can email us at info@portfoliomatters.co.uk, or you can leave a comment. But the more information, the better. And if you can persuade us to change our minds, we will change our minds. In the meantime, thank you all for watching. Please can you press like and subscribe to the channel, and it's goodbye from Richard Wheater.
And it's goodbye from Keith Jordan. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Full disclaimer. The material and information contained in this podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only and should not be relied upon for making a business, legal or any other decision. We may own or have a financial interest in any securities mentioned. Listeners should conduct their own research or consult a professional investment advisor before making any decisions regarding topics mentioned on the show. Whilst we endeavour to ensure that the information presented on the show is correct, we make no representations or warranties of any kind, express or implied, with respect to the podcast and website or to any information, products, services or related graphics discussed or presented in the podcast or website. Any reliance you place on such material is strictly at your own risk. You are solely responsible for the investment decisions you make. We will not be responsible for any errors or omissions in the podcast or website, including in articles or postings, for hyperlinks embedded in messages, or for any results obtained from the use of such information. Nor will we be liable for any loss or damage, including consequential damages, if any, caused by a reader's reliance on any information provided by the podcast or website. Please do not listen to the podcast if you do not accept self-responsibility for your actions.